Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We are glad to have you here, and we'll be spending the next 90 minutes together and learning more about the work of Brigitte Shim, architect Brigitte Shim. I'm going to share my screen right now and give you some introductory comments, and then we'll get started with the work. Okay. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about who's made it possible for us to be here this afternoon. The sponsors of this program are the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity and Transition, together with the Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality Forum, known as ACSF. ACSF is an international organization that supports research, practice, education, and advocacy on the significance, experience, and meanings of the built environment. Founded in 2007, ACSF hosts annual symposia at places with spiritual significance. It publishes research, maintains a website as an open source scholarly archive, and it produces a bi-monthly newsletter. It also supports scholars, practitioners, and students through annual grants, awards programs, and scholarships. It is the only organization of its type that directly addresses the spiritual and cultural aspects of the built environment. The Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke, the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, and the Center on Modernity and Transition are proud to partner with ACSF to help amplify its vision through this speaker series on spirituality in contemporary architecture. And now I want to introduce our guest presenter for today's program. Brigitte Shim is a celebrated architect based in Toronto, where she collaborates and practices with partner Howard Sutcliffe. In their practice, they share a deep concern for the cultural and spiritual significance of architecture, landscape, and interior and industrial design. Their work demonstrates a commitment to themes of the spiritual and the sacred in architecture and landscape. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, Shim immigrated to Canada in 1965. She studied at the University of Waterloo, where she graduated with degrees in environmental studies in 1981 and architecture in 1983. She apprenticed with Arthur Erickson in Vancouver and then worked for Baird Sampson Architects in Toronto. In 1988, she began teaching at the University of Toronto, where she is currently a professor of architecture. She's been an invited visiting professor at Yale University, the Cooper Union, and Harvard. Among Shim Sutcliffe's celebrated works in the realm of the sacred are Congregation Bethlehem, Synagogue, which we will learn more about this afternoon, designed to aid in the transition from the everyday to the sacred. The Wang Day Temple in Toronto, the Atherley Narrows Bridge Project, which addresses concepts of Native American spirituality and preservation of 5,000-year-old fishing weirs, and the chapel and residence for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Toronto. Shim Sutcliffe's work has won local, national, and international recognition and awards, has been exhibited internationally, and has been published throughout the world. In 2020, Shim and Sutcliffe won the ACSF Outstanding Achievement Award, and in 2021, they were awarded the Gold Medal of the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada. Welcome, Brigitte Shim.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be part of this series, and I look forward to a really engaging discussion with some wonderful colleagues. So let me now just share my screen with you. Can everyone, I think, are you seeing notes there? Did I do the wrong one, or are you seeing the screen?
It looks good, Brigitte.
Good. Okay,
Yep.
wonderful. So thank you, Michael. You really talked about the fact that I work collaboratively with Howard Sutcliffe. And in a way, every building we do is also a collaboration. And the project that I'll share with you, Beta Am, is no different from really being a bottom-up project and working with a remarkable group of individuals to realize this project. In a way, I think that Howard and I are always trying to amplify our work through light. And our winter light is really precious, and our summer light is often too harsh. So this is a view of a very early project where we're trying to show light. Can you see this image right now? Is it the right one, Michael?
Yes, it looks like an interior with a skylight on the top.
Okay, great, super. Then we also, we're always thinking about light in different conditions. So this is a summer camp, but we're really creating a kind of light monitor in the middle using very off-the-shelf elements, glue lamp frames, tie rods, and then 2x4s, really connecting light with natural ventilation. A very recent project on the Canadian Shield where we used a series of Douglas fir-clad trusses combined with clear story windows to help us really shape our space with light. We're always trying to link light and nature, which is an ongoing interest. So this is a kind of leaf pattern of a black locust tree in the Carolinian forest in a Toronto ravine. And so for us, nature and culture are always woven together in our work. And the only color that you're seeing in this image is actually the transmission of light through the autumn leaves of the adjacent forest. So as Canadians, we live at 43 degrees latitude in a seasonal climatic zone. It's really cold today in Toronto, so we can really tell. We're always trying to harness light as a force to help us continually recalibrate our understanding of place and context. So I would say as architects, we always want to paint with light. The question of how you do that is complicated. And in a way, in our view, remarkable experiments with light are only possible through the exploration of the architectural section. A few years ago, the University of Venice asked us to contribute to an exhibition at the Venice Biennale, and it was called Architecture Seen in Section. So they asked architects from all around the world to draw large-scale sections through some of their buildings. And so here we are looking at it, and we call this walls of light. Because we really wanted to explore how small apertures could amplify light and shape light in spaces. So this is 6 projects, but the one on the very far left is actually Congregation Beta Am, and the one right next to it is a very small studio building. And here we're actually using a kind of a skylight, not operable, part of a green roof, and we're using it to bring light into a kind of small space. And here you're actually seeing the space itself. We're using birch plywood in the upper portion. There's a horizontal datum at 8 feet, but the depth of each of the different coffers in each wall is actually quite different and creating different effects. So this kind of idea of always experimenting and always exploring the kind of way that light is actually understood through section is a kind of ongoing preoccupation, and this kind of experimentation is kind of part of what we always do. A very early project that is a kind of the St. Catherine's Chapel at Massey College. It's a non-denominational chapel where we created a series of wooden vaults. And then we're actually trying to kind of explore light, celebrate light in a kind of very interior space. I think Michael mentioned the Wang Dai Sin Temple. Taoism is actually, along with Confucianism and Buddhism, one of the oldest religions in the world. And in Taoism in particular, the mind and the body are in concert. So Tai Chi is not an exercise, but literally part of their spirituality. And so we really pondered, what does a Taoist temple look like in our contemporary world, especially in a very suburban location in Toronto. So for us, light in this project is realized through a series of light monitors over circular skylights. It's also a kind of armature for incense, which they burn constantly. And this kind of smoke is actually connecting you always to your ancestors. And then each skylight is kind of motorized, enabling both the smoke to rise up and also to create really great cross ventilation. And then a chapel for a group of Catholic nuns in Toronto. We're always trying to push our spaces into the landscape and pull the landscape inside. And this kind of idea that the nuns really wanted their chapel to be the heart and soul of their new home. So we situated it in a reflecting pool surrounded by a verdant ravine landscape. So this idea of the water being able to really measure these shifts of temperature, states of ice, snow, mist was really important. So here we are, Shim and Sutcliffe designing a Jewish synagogue in Portland, Maine. And we basically started by really spending time with this amazing, vibrant, dynamic community. And we started by asking them questions. So as opposed to beginning by saying we know anything, we really needed to hear from the community. We asked them, how can the exterior and interior entry sequence contribute to the journey from the secular to the holy world? We asked them, how can we make your sanctuary a sacred space embedded with meaning for Jewish life? We asked them, how can your building respond to the passage of light from day to night? We asked them, how does the building acknowledge the role of education in every stage of Jewish life? And how does the synagogue teach your own community and others about who you are and what you value? So I would say those 5 questions were really part of a community-wide conversation, and we really listened carefully, and it became the kind of starting point for our journey with them. Alice Dubinsky was the rabbi who we worked with, and she was a very active member of the Reform Judaism community in America. And we visited the congregation many times and observed the same group of people gathering on Friday evenings for service, welcoming the sunset, which was so important to their liturgy, and then convening in the same space on Saturday morning as part of their kind of ongoing services. So we wondered if we could find a way to register the light at different times of the day, knowing the space wasn't going to change at all, like, physically, but how can the light transform in this same space? And we wondered, could the light at sunset differ from the early morning light that you had in the space? And could light become embedded in the everyday lives of the members of this Beta Am community? And how does light become embedded in the life of a space? So we study this question both in drawings, but also in models. So here you're seeing a kind of flatter wall, a more articulated wall. This is kind of assuming a very local way of cladding, which is clapboard, which is very much part of the Maine vernacular. And we also studied the building section to understand how you would capture light through the day. And then as architects, we used a combination of clear story windows and skylights with an angled baffle as a tool to shape our light through the course of the day. So in this architectural section, this is the one we actually did for the Venice Biennale, you can see that we've combined a kind of skylight on the roof with a clear story window. And then there's also a kind of angled baffle, and light, you're never aware of either the skylight or the clear story from the inside of the space, but you're only aware of the light reflecting off of the front of the baffle or behind the baffle. So in a way, the baffle becomes a register of the light, and in a way, a kind of register of time through the day. And here's a kind of overall site plan where we work with, on the left, you can see in plan is an existing Portland public school, which we renovated to become their religious school. And before this renovation, everything was in that school. They had their sanctuary, social hall, all of their kind of youth activities, and they couldn't fit any more in this building. And so we renovated only to be the religious school. And we added we created a new courtyard between the existing building and the new building, and then a kind of new sanctuary social hall, and then a reflecting pool and a landscape. So here's the site plan where you can see the kind of entry courtyard, the existing Portland Public School. And then in the space, what we actually tried to do was to create a social hall and a sanctuary. And then there is a kind of partition wall that opens up. And when they have high holidays, they can all gather under one roof, which is always a challenge for so many religious communities. And so here's a view from the adjacent park, where you can see in the foreground the new sanctuary social hall, and then in the background you can see the two-story red bricked Portland Public School. This is a view from Westbrook Street, which is the kind of long street, and you can see the public school, former public school on the left-hand side, a kind of long elevation where there are the rabbi's offices, the library, and then behind that you can see the clear story of the sanctuary social hall. And here you can see as you enter, so this is actually a view of the courtyard, and you're actually looking on the left straight ahead to the sanctuary social hall. The entrance is on the right, and then behind you is the Portland Public School. And then this is a view of the a study drawing of the hallway leading toward the sanctuary. So you're really drawn by the light and you're moving toward the landscape. And here's a view of this canted wall, which is clad in a local clapboard to really register the light. And then you can see the views of the landscape beyond. And then here we are at a place of pause before you enter the sanctuary, and this kind of sense of the inside wall literally becoming the outside wall. And in section, again, this is a section through that very same moment of pause. And you can actually see that the section, even though it all has a clear story and skylight, is actually asymmetrical. So the section, what you're seeing is the wall on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the sanctuary are actually slightly different in their proportions. And we use this to really try to capture the light of the sunset, especially in the middle of winter. So we're really embracing the sunset and we're bringing it into the project. And then here's a view in this upper portion, you can see the skylight clear story detail and start to read this asymmetry, and you're looking at that hallway from the other direction with the reflecting pool on the right. And then a view of the congregation in the space with the reflecting pool and gathering inside the space. And this is probably a better image to view the kind of asymmetry. In a way, when I said this is a bottom-up project, the garden was actually a whole community project by members of the Beta community, and they really look after it, and it's really part of their expression of community. And here's a view of the whole space. And you can see the kind of skylight and the way light enters the space, the bowed wood ceiling to the underside of the trusses. And then here you can see this partition wall where it actually separates this long space to become sanctuary social hall. And then it moves into the bays that are created through the structure when they have their high holidays. And again, the sense looking back towards the public school and the entry court. And then a view of the sanctuary. And really this kind of sense of what it feels like during the daytime, and then the transformation to night. And then again, this kind of sense of, so here we are coming from Canada, building in New England, and what we asked them to do was to actually invert the clapboard. So as opposed to having it be lines of shadow, we actually wanted the clapboard to be lines of light. And when light falls on it, the light is articulated as opposed to the shadow. And so really in this image, you really see the kind of way that light actually becomes part of your everyday experience. And again, depending on the time of day, the light is actually positioned in front of this slope baffle or behind the baffle. And you're always aware of the time of day, the time of year, when you are experiencing the building. And so for us, this was a really important dimension of trying to work with a community to kind of realize their vision and to really root it in the place itself. So Maine is at, again, 43 degrees latitude. You're actually flying horizontal when you go from Toronto to Maine. It's a more maritime climate. And in a way, this kind of changing seasonal dimension is something we love to be part of and to explore and celebrate. So here's a section, an early study section, but you can see this kind of sense of the asymmetry and the way that we're welcoming the sunset and the early morning light into the space. And then this is a view of their ark, and they have several special Torahs. One is actually a Holocaust Torah, and this is actually a view taken by one of the members of the congregation in February. So you're actually getting this kind of low winter light actually penetrating from the west side all the way through to the east side and to illuminate, in effect, their special sacred documents, the Torah. And here's a view of the outside, but again, you can see the sense of these lines of light that we were really trying to kind of embed into the space. And I would say trying to do this using very humble materials, a very low budget. It wasn't a fancy budget at all, working with renovation and new construction and a kind of nonprofit group, and really trying to kind of achieve something that really was able to be inspiring, but also work within a whole set of parameters that were really part of the reality of the project. Here's a view taken in winter. So we created a landscape. It's actually adjacent to a public park in Portland and one of the most well-visited Dunkin' Donut sites. So we really created a kind of space within it. So there's a kind of wooden fence around it and the park adjacent to it. And you can see the reflecting pool, the sanctuary, and then the former public school in the distance. And one of the things they really wanted was this kind of idea of the water and the garden was about bringing nature into their sanctuary and their sacred space. And so this was really part of one of the answers to the 5 questions that we asked at the very beginning. And I felt like we heard them very loud and clear that they wanted to see nature and they wanted to experience the changing aspects of nature to really enrich their liturgy on a weekly basis. And then I have some photos. So we've actually never photographed the actual high holidays in this space because it's really not appropriate from a Jewish perspective. But here are some photos that were actually taken by members of the congregation and shared with us. So you really get a sense of the different ways that the community has actually embraced the space and used it in different ways. And it's been very hard for all religious groups during this COVID period, because what is normally the center of Jewish life for this Reform congregation has been closed, and it's been really challenging. And I think that we're all looking forward to reopening and kind of being able to re-engage in new ways. This was a concert, and here this was taken by one of the members of the congregation, but you're seeing the way that the space is used both inside and outside. And then really the kind of way that the supper, which is actually technical for roof drainage, actually becomes part of the kind of experience of this project. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen And that's my
Okay,
presentation.
thank you for sharing that building. I'm really impressed about how complex this building is. It has got a lot of meat to it, so to speak. And the fact that it's so complex, just in terms of the walls, how the walls work with the roof and the windows, I wondered if you could tell us how you communicated with the congregation and the client, because most people can read a plan, maybe because it's like a map, right? When we look at a plan, it's like a map. But when you show them a section, it really is complicated in terms of what you're even looking at, what a section is. So I'm wondering what you did did you show the model, or how did you work with them?
So I think we used, a lot of the images that I showed, the model photographs, the perspective drawings were really critical to having a kind of, nonprofit group, a religious group actually understand it. We were really fortunate. We had an amazing building committee and they were really remarkable in terms of being able to communicate the kind of we asked the questions, but then we had to disseminate the questions and then translate them into a built form, right? Which was really challenging. I think luckily, we actually did a whole design, and then they had to do their fundraising, which was about a 2-year period. So there was a pause. And I would say, timeline wise, that little studio that we showed you with the kind of we actually built that because we love doing these smaller projects because they can be realized fast, and we actually built that in the meantime and kind of pondered the lessons we learned from it. And then we actually proposed not a flat ceiling but a shaped ceiling for the underside of the main sanctuary social hall. And we had to so we didn't change the plan, but we in effect changed the experience of the space through using an upside down bow truss and then cladding that, putting all the mechanical through the middle, and then being able to kind of use that. And so I think that by the time we restarted after their fundraising, we kind of, we had a slightly different idea and we kind of represented it again. And I think that it didn't necessarily cost them any more money to do this because it was just, but it helped for us to shape the space in a really more meaningful way. And so I feel like the kind of our good fortune was really to have members of a building committee. One of the key members was an architect named Jeremy Moser. And he was both a member of the congregation, but also trained as an architect. And he had a really critical role in really educating the building committee because they're in Portland, Maine. He actually took them all to Exeter Library by Lou John, and they all sat in Exeter Library and said, well, we're not going to be building Exeter Library, but we actually want to aspire to a building that actually has meaning. And so he was really so important in terms of really becoming a really important link between what the building could be. And not that it would cost you 3 times more, but how can we aspire to have something that feeds us on a daily basis? Or the questions. So and I think that for us, we're designing a building, but we're also designing a process. And that by asking the questions, sitting in Gabbai committee and all of their kind of different religious moments throughout the year, it really gave us a sense as to who they were and how we could respond in a way that would really create a space that would bring something to the community over many years. And I think that's what we were trying to do, and with limited means. Like there weren't sort of tons of things you could do. There's a site, there's all kinds of zoning bylaws, building code issues I'm not even going to talk about. But with these limitations, we really wanted to give them a building that could really center their community and allow them to do so many things in the future. And I think that that's what we were really trying to achieve.
Did they come to you with any kind of visual ideas about what they wanted or what they thought they would like or anything? This is actually a question from one of our audience members.
So synagogues don't have a typology.
That's correct.
So,
Yeah.
so there is no type. And when you
Yeah.
look through the history of synagogues, they're everything from like those amazing wooden synagogues in Poland are incredible. And there's Frank Lloyd Wright synagogues and Marcel Breuer synagogues, but they don't follow a typology.
Right.
And so there wasn't really a kind of specific, kind of image that they had in mind. So it was a kind of fairly open question. And I think that made it really interesting for us as architects.
Were you involved in designing the eternal light in the sanctuary itself? I don't know if you showed a picture of
it's
that.
actually called a Ner Tamid.
Yes.
So we designed the reading table, the ark, the Ner Tamid. There's some shelves for special candlesticks. So we worked really closely with the rabbi to kind of make sure that all of those liturgical pieces were really intact. And what I didn't present in the presentation is because it was this long space, so half of it is normally a social hall and the other half is a sanctuary, like maybe 100 to 250 people on a weekly basis, which is really great for a kind of synagogue. But then when they have high holidays, they'll need 700, 800, 900 people. So all of those wooden storage units go into the bays, and the entire thing becomes the sanctuary. And so but they know like way in advance that this is happening. So what we do is they take all of the reading table, the ark, the Ner Tamid, and all of that is actually recentered and moved 4 bays over to be the center of the whole space. Okay. And then when they actually lay out all their seating, no one is that far from the reading table.
Yes.
And so it's kind of like and then they put it back. So it's kind of, but they know so long in advance and they kind of figure it out, and there's a whole moving schedule. And that's how they deal with this relationship between the everyday and the high holidays, which is really a challenge for all religious communities to kind of be able to handle both, and so that they don't end up feeling like they're in like a hotel ballroom or something when they're all together, because I've seen so many different examples that are so unsatisfying.
Yes, it's a tough problem to solve. Brigitte, I'm going to bring in our panelists, and before I actually bring them in, I'm going to tell you and the audience a little bit about who they are. So I'm going to share my screen again here. There we go. And give you a little bit of an introduction here to who will be with us. Okay. So our first panelist is Vanessa Avery, and she is Executive Director of Sharing Sacred Spaces, where she builds local, diverse model micro-communities through sustained partnership and action using the unique vehicles of sacred space, architecture, and radical hospitality. Avery is also a lecturer in interfaith engagement at the Yale Divinity School, an affiliate faculty at California State University, and the author of numerous articles on world religions, interfaith understanding, organizational culture, and religion, violence, and peace. She is also an executive and professional education fellow at the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace in Hartford, Connecticut, and former senior associate in diversity with Cambridge Hill Partners. Our second panelist is Michael Benedict, who is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture, where he holds the Howell Box Chair in Urbanism and teaches design studio and architectural theory. He received his Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, and his Master of Environmental Design from Yale. In 2004, he was named a distinguished professor by the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. Benedict has published more than 120 articles and chapters in books, and has delivered over 95 invited lectures in the US and abroad. He's the author of the books God, Creativity and Evolution, The Argument from Designers, and God is in the Good We Do, among others. And then our third panelist this afternoon is David Leatherboro. He is Emeritus Professor of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, where he taught architectural design, history, and theory since 1984, and served as chair of the PhD program for approximately 2 decades. Before his tenure at Pennsylvania, he taught in England, Cambridge University, and the Polytechnic Central in London. He's also visited and taught at many universities throughout the world and has held guest professorships in Europe, South America, and Asia. Leatherboro studied architecture at the University of Kentucky and completed his PhD in art at the University of Essex. His research has focused on various topics in the history and theory of architecture, gardens, urbanism, and the ecological issues and impact of contemporary technology on architecture in the city. His latest book, Building Time, is his 10th book. In 2020, he received the Topaz Medallion for Excellence in Architectural Education from the ACSA and AIA. And that same year, he received the ACSF Award for Outstanding Achievement. Please welcome our 3 panelists. And I'm going to stop sharing here. And I'm going to ask Vanessa to start. Each of our panelists will have about 10 or 15 minutes to react and ask questions and engage with Brigitte.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for the introduction. And Brigitte, thank you so much for your beautiful building and a really great presentation, which enabled me to come to understand more about the building as well as the process for designing it and working closely with the community. Several things really struck me about the space, and the first you talked about quite a lot. It's the experience the space offers of nature's rhythms. The space enables the congregation to observe and really be moved by the nature surrounding it. And I think of the biblical history and the narratives that are told throughout the year in Jewish celebrations that point to the revelation of God in nature and through nature also. So in general, it seems humans, I know I sit here in my Zoom office and I'm more and more disconnected from nature in daily life. And so the fact that you could take this space and infuse it with nature, which to me is a portal to the spiritual and to the divine, is really essential. And you mentioned the liturgy as well, and I wanted to bring in that there's a very well-known Jewish scholar named Abraham Joshua Heschel. He wrote a book called The Sabbath, where he describes the weekly Sabbath not in terms of a sacred space, but as a cathedral in time. And in Judaism, there is this focus on sacred time, and Heschel even calls Jewish observances like the Sabbath, which you talked about a lot as well in your design. He calls the Sabbath an architecture of time, where you have this period of time carved out when one is closer to the divine. So I think it's really incredible as you have here your architecture in space that facilitates the experience of sacred time through its openness and connection to nature. You talked elaborately about how the sunset, I should say, is depicted, emphasizing the light even in a place like Maine, and that just connects one to the larger rhythm of the universe and really to Jewish observant life. So the space is just beautifully oriented to witness this carving out of time. I also wanted to, the second thing that struck me was, should I keep going or should I allow Brigitte to respond to I had 3 points.
I think keep going, please.
Okay.
You want to, I was going to say, do you want to, please jump in there, Brigitte, whenever you
Yeah, please, whenever.
No, I think you're
All
doing
good.
great. Mhm.
The structure also, what I didn't know that much about it, I just looked at some images that I could see online, and it struck me as a temporary structure, although it's permanent, of course. It kind of befits its place and nature of what, if you will. It struck me, it looked a little bit like a ship from the front. The lines of it gave me this impression, and it's also situated behind a reflecting pool, which underlined that for me. It also looked a little bit on the inside like a tent, so it feels comfortable, if you will, like a personal, intimate space, overall less formal and inviting. Abraham and Sarah's tent, maybe. And all the moving elements inside that you just talked about as well, which are typically not movable. I think that underscores I guess the transitoriness that I was feeling, and thinking about how that befits a people in exile living in the diaspora, where there's certainly a history of needing to be flexible and move around. So I find the permanency of the space that you've built juxtaposed with the impermanence of the interior objects and the feeling to be really very interesting and profoundly historical as well as theological.
So I think that's such an amazing observation, because as I was explaining to Michael, we actually had a design with a flat roof. And then what happened is they spent 2 years fundraising. And so there was a pause. We didn't come and visit. They were just raising their kind of funds to build the project. And then when we restarted, we actually said, we actually think the roof should actually not be flat. And we actually did the shaped roof. And the rabbi saw it, and Alice, and she said, it feels like a tent. And that she loved the idea that it felt like a tent, and that all of the issues of it being more embracing, and kind of this idea of a tent in the desert was kind of what she brought up to us. And we actually it was an intuitive sense about helping to shape the space, and using, again, these limited means to do it. But this kind of question of temporary versus permanent, especially within Judaism, is such an interesting and kind of deep question. And so for me, the fact that you read both the temporariness, and then and kind of, but maybe the walls feel permanent, but everything else is moving, or this kind of sense of layeredness of I just thought was such a great observation, and really so insightful, because I guess in all of our work, we're always saying, if it's a good ruin, maybe it will be a good building, and using that as the test, as opposed to saying we design these heroic buildings that will last forever. Maybe the ruin is a sign that the building might be good. And so this kind of notion of time is an ongoing question that we talk about all the time in all of our work. And so to be able to kind of see this synagogue as kind of questioning this sense of time during the day, but also time as a larger question relative to Judaism, I think, again, and then the time of construction, where it wasn't this very linear process. We had all our money in place. It was really this time of reflection through their fundraising that allowed us to kind of rethink a part of a building that normally you just never get to rethink. But I feel like it was a very positive addition to the project by having this kind of a pause and a kind of reflection.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you. Your design works, and thank you for acknowledging that the impressions were processed somehow through that, throughout the design process and the building. I had one more question, which came, kind of the last thing that I was thinking about. And really, it's because of the rise in anti-Semitic crimes over the last 5 years or so, of all the hate crimes based in religion, and in the past year, 60% of them have been anti-Semitic. So we've heard about the one in Colleyville, Texas. I think it was after you built the synagogue as well that Squirrel Hill near Pittsburgh also happened, the shooting there. So I was just wondering if because there's so much glass and so many windows, was security raised as an issue during the process?
So what happened was originally the public school actually entered off of Westbrook Street, which was the main elevation that I showed you. It's a very busy street. And part of what we actually showed them several different site plans. And what we actually did is we flipped the whole thing. So there's a small side street that is now the new entrance. There's a parking lot, and it actually creates almost like a little campus with the existing building, the courtyard. And I think that by actually flipping it, it actually created, you know, both a public presence on Westbrook Street, but it also allowed it to kind of be a bit more secure than it was before. So there's kind of a way of almost entering the courtyard as kind of part of the entry to the grouping of buildings, as opposed to, so you come into a new entrance that isn't the former school or the new sanctuary. It becomes that hallway, and then you go one side to the religious school, and you know, so it changes the whole reading, where before it was just one singular building entering off of one street. And I think it's helped them a bit to kind of have a bit more security. But it is a really important issue because these buildings don't want to be separate, and they don't want to be kind of turning their back on the neighborhood, but there's some very real concerns that have to be addressed. And so it's a really, you know, it's a poignant question at a moment where, you know, we have to really think about all of these things carefully. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for explaining that. I appreciate it. And my daughter appreciates it too, who came into my screen. Thank you.
Vanessa, thanks very much for your questions and your comments. They're great. Michael, I'm going to ask you to jump in here next.
Right. Can you hear me? Well, Brigitte, what a beautiful building. And I love seeing the portfolio of buildings that are a little similar from your own oeuvre. And you help me appreciate again, when you use terms like painting with light, how beautifully you do that in all of your buildings. And especially in this one, I suppose, because you know, you do a very daring thing, which is really choke the light down for the great length of the roof. So I have to say, as I listened to you, I had my comments were more like curiosities, and they were quite often technical curiosities, like,
Sure. Mm-hmm.
How did you do this? How did you do that? And the other bunch of questions are more, we say, theological. I am Jewish myself. I've visited many different communities, from the most Reform or Reconstructionist communities to the most Orthodox. And there's quite a lot of disagreement among those groups as to what an appropriate synagogue is. It was instantly clear to me that this was a Reform synagogue. There's a casualness to it, for example, about where the ark is, you know, to make that movable, or to use, you know, just chairs.
Yeah.
There are a lot of communities that would find that far too casual, and probably would not actually take up the narrative of the wandering Jew and like repeat it inside of a you know, a community hall sort of thing. But the Reform is different, and Reform Jews are actually much more open to that, and much more open to thinking of nature as sacred. And as Vanessa said, there's lots in the Bible of regard for nature as God's work and as a place to sort of relate to. On the more Orthodox side of things, you would never, so to speak, diss nature, but it would be about Mount Sinai. It would be about the personal relationship to God as a kind of a father figure, sort of revelations over and above nature would be, and the book, and so on and so forth. So on a more conservative role, you would never take the Torah and play with it, and unroll it and, let everyone sort of look at how it rolls up and rolls down. You treat it with the utmost reverence, and you have to kiss it and all kinds of things. So I just want to point out that what you've very accurately done here is reflected that Jewish community, I think. And to get back to the architecture itself, I personally really enjoyed the, it's not really a catenary, is it, Brigitte? Is it a part of a radius? Is it
It's a
circle?
bowstring truss,
Yeah,
but flipped upside down.
yeah, but it is a circular section, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Out of wood.
Yeah. So, of course, that section reminded me immediately of Ronchamp, with a very famous thick wall, which you've so beautifully deconstructed. And I don't know if you felt like that's where that came from, or that was a commentary within, within our discipline specifically. I would not expect your clients to really say, oh, wow, look at this, but letting the light in through a concave at the high part and so forth. And I think Corb would have just loved what you did with the ribs of light, and how you made even that fine amount of light just really work on both sides. And I love the difference on either side. I think what was also wonderful, I assume that the hall itself runs north-south, right?
Actually,
So that
it runs, yeah.
So that you would get east-west, you'd get a morning condition and an evening and afternoon condition. And I do think that was one of the really great things about your design too, because all of Jewish liturgy starts in the evening. There's things to do first thing. They don't run by clock time like a railway station. You keep adjusting. You adjust for lunar time and you adjust for daily time. So ceremonies start at sunset, whenever that is.
Yeah.
In fact, you have to be told when we're starting, because it depends on when the sun comes out and the sun goes down. And I thought it was a really masterful the way you handled that. A kind of, go back to a more slightly technical thing. I noticed there was water coming off the roof. In the center of the roof, but I also noticed that the roof is actually a slightly sloped flat roof. So you must have,
from the middle, it slopes to
one
so
side.
ended up sloping to one side.
But then you had to bring it back somehow.
Yeah. So it was a bit tricky, but I think that in a way, the whole idea of the last image was that really the roof is a big collector of water, and it becomes a big scupper that actually drains into the fountain. And so the idea that you actually get to see, in a rainstorm, that's kind of where you want to be, as opposed to,
absolutely.
And as opposed to just putting it into the stormwater system invisibly. It was
beautiful.
actually a kind of expression of the kind of this
day-to-day. But the rain never contacts that dish. It's taken to one side and brought back, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is fascinating. I also like the way you put an extra crescent onto that elevation as a kind of a side-facing porch, which sort of pushes back the mass of the roof and reinscribes that catenary crescent of the bowstring. I thought that was very masterfully done. So I have some other notes here, but they'll come back maybe as the discussion goes on. But thanks for a really a master's show of how to do beautiful architecture on a budget too. And I think it was gorgeous. Thank you so much.
Thank you. One of the things we struggled with is kind of the expression at either end of the sanctuary and the social hall. And this issue of pushing the mass back was kind of really important, because otherwise it wasn't about a heaviness, but
Yeah.
actually about a lightness. So how you kind of shape that is kind of a key architectural moment. And then in Maine, getting the right people to build it in the way that you want
Oh,
it,
gosh, yeah.
kind of a tribute to the patients of the community. And but it was for us such an important condition. And the way it's read on the social hall side, it's kind of as both are key, really important.
I didn't realize, when I first saw the picture, I thought that entire partition wall was on wheels and it just like trundled, but in fact it decomposes. Is that what you're saying?
So they actually, when they know so long in advance about when their high holidays are. So there's like a little pallet lift that it's like they actually own it, and they just come in and they lift it up, and then they move it into one of the bays. So there's a whole procedure, and
But
then
it breaks up, right? It breaks up into parts.
Different segments. It goes into each of the bays, and then day to day they just use it for tons of storage, extra chairs and stuff that they need. So it's very both functional, but also it allows them to create the one big space very easily and without a lot of fuss.
And can I ask just one more little question?
Sure.
If this were, I'm an inventor, I'm a design teacher, so I just like look at this stuff all the time. I would say, do you ever have a glare problem from the one side?
Because it's such a narrow, like the combination of the skylight clear story is actually it's not very big at all. It's actually never kind of a big issue. And then
from the glass side.
From the glass side.
Yeah.
At ground level.
Yeah. There's like light, a lot of light coming in off of snow or off of the ground outside.
So what happens is that this kind of canopy that's the overhang for both the reflecting pool and the courtyard side is really deep. And so it actually provides a lot of sun shading from both ends, which are floor to ceiling glass. So it actually does it helps a lot for that condition.
Wonderful. Michael, sorry to get so geeky there, but I am interested.
You're asking questions that are floating through our brains anyway.
Okay, well,
and that's good.
and I do have some other themes, but I know that David's going to have a lot to contribute. So.
Okay. David, do you want to jump in there next?
Sure, though with some hesitation, because having studied the building online and written down some notes, I now discover that what I wanted to observe has already been set out very beautifully by Vanessa and Michael.
That's
to say
the problem
nothing
with going last, right?
Say nothing about.
Yeah.
But when a work and its designer speak so eloquently for themselves, I must say one feels reluctant trying to add anything, especially before the pleasure of a visit. Nonetheless, I'll risk a few comments, which are partly descriptive, partly interpretive. Like the others, Brigitte, I also focused on some details, the horizontal cladding, the clapboards, likewise the scupper, but also what I'll call the scroll cabinet, tucked into the midpoint in the run of the structural system. I think each of those parts or details performs atypically. The first in its production of what you've so nicely called blinds of light, not shadow. Second, this overflow into the pool. As you say, typically water is done away with. Here it's put on show. And thirdly, this interruption in the rhythm of intervals between the vertical supports. Any architectural performance, like any event, unfolds over time. I think that's obvious, and we've already said it today. It's a time that we expect to unfold with great regularity. Yesterday seems to be like tomorrow. The day after sort of repeats the day before. But in this building, it's the atypicality, particularly of those details, that causes me to suggest at the outset of my comments, Brigitte, that here, quoting Hamlet, time is out of joint. In London, there's a weekly news sheet called Time Out. I think it refers to outdoors, but also a break in the regular schedule, kind of like a timeout in a basketball game.
Yeah.
It seems to me when time is suspended, awareness is excited. Atypical details and atypical moments are in this sense, in the sense of your building, inaugural. I think one's awareness of something often overlooked is provoked, animated. And I believe in this case, it's something hidden in everyday affairs, a remote, self-hiding object of worship. I think that in good architecture, time's registration is three-part. Buildings are clocks, calendars, and chronicles. I think that's present in this building. So let me, just the only comment really I wanted to make is how those three temporalities seem embodied here. The walls, the pool, and the structural frame. Each, as I've said, is an image of regularity, the linear continuity of the wall, the calm flatness of the pool, and also the steady rhythm of the columns. Yet these three open themselves to ambient conditions. And I believe through the design, they make a point of showing what they encounter. The wall makes a show of the daylight because of the way the clapboards are lapped. The ripples in the pool make a show of the wind. And the central interval in the frame, I believe its task is to disclose the word when previously cabineted scrolls are brought out and read aloud. So the lines of light are atypically intense. The scupper makes the force of the wind uncommonly visible in the pool's turbulence. And of course, the density of content in the scroll makes one point in the rhythm of structure uniquely central. So to repeat what I think has been said already twice, the evening of is radically different from the morning of Shabbat. The walls inscribed lines of light clock this decisive change. Or at a longer temporality, the breaks in seasonal change are made legible through the scupper. Hard ice won't flow. Spring rains have great force. A parched summer leaves it dry. As has been said by Vanessa, this is not only secular, but a sacred calendar rendered visible through the building. And of course, the stories of the Jews are read and reread when the cabinet scrolls are opened. So to summarize these notes, at least my sense of it is that what philosophers call disclosure, or theologians revelation, they assume time out of joint, a break in the regular flow of things. unexpected moments in the rhythms of the natural world. This is to say that these strange, beautifully strange, atypical details are instruments of revelation. They break the expectation of continuity only to allow us to see it again and restart the clock, recycle the seasons, and reread the chronicle. I think the building in that sense incorporates theology and it's rendered visible through its unexpected and unexpectedly beautiful details. Or so it seems to me, Brigitte.
Thank you. That was so beautiful, David. That was so eloquent and so insightful. You kind of spend all this time working on it, and I feel like I've kind of been able to take a whole step back and reread something I know so well in such a beautiful way. I just really appreciate your insights and your thoughts. I think that it's a complicated process designing buildings, and then to work with a community to kind of realize a collective vision it's not an easy thing. And I think that this kind of I really love this kind of time out of joint, this kind of the sort of idea that there's a seemingly rational condition to everything, and partly the architectural process, there's zoning and there's building code and there's all kinds of, you present to a board of directors and everything has to be normative at one level. It has to look kind of normal because it's, you're using limited resources, you have to spend it wisely. But then how you kind of create these kind of this delight and this kind of refocusing on the kind of what is the sacred, who are we, why are we here? So this kind of connecting the landscape, the reflecting pool, and the sanctuary was kind of like a critical juncture. And then the kind of the ability to say, if we want to gather under one space for our high holidays, and we don't want to have the kids' table and the adult table, we want to all be together. How do we actually get to do that in a way that that is kind of meaningful? And we looked at so the struggle of that was really hard. And then how do we work in a place like Portland, Maine, where there's a whole boat building culture and all these clapboard wood buildings everywhere? And how do we not stand out to be this weird building in the neighborhood, but actually work with the vernacular, but rethink the vernacular at the same time? So in a way so here are all these three different balls that you're kind of juggling all at the same time. But I thought the way you were able to distill that to being kind of this kind of, because the whole point of the sacred space is to remind us about why we're here and to reinforce our sense of community. And that in these 5 questions we asked them at the beginning, the role of nature really resonated across a very broad spectrum of people. And Reform Judaism is complicated. So there were 4 retired rabbis in this congregation when we designed this building. So they all had an opinion. We sat through Gabbai committee where, we were at the beginning of the Torah. They spent an hour talking about the word the. It was a huge discussion, about but we got to observe as a firsthand all of this amazing kind of discussion, trying to bring life to this ancient document and make it relevant to the contemporary world that they were all living in. And I just so appreciated being able to listen and to hear the dynamic, vital conversations that went on about and so I feel like we had to somehow capture this dynamism in a way that and I would never call, I would call this building very quiet at one level. Like it's not a flashy building. You could probably just drive by it and not really notice it. And so this whole idea of unfolding and revealing over time is kind of built into the DNA of it. And I just thought you were so eloquent in kind of articulating these kinds of aspirations that were kind of deeply embedded in what we felt the building should be telling or sharing throughout its kind of life as the community evolves. And I just think you were so, it was just so beautiful the way you.
But I think when the rabbi reads, there is a echoing of the way the building has voiced, whether it's the wind or the rain. So the light is no doubt part of it, but there is a voice to the building, and it's amplified, as that was your opening term. And I believe it's a resonant term because there are reverberations of content in the, not just the reiterations, but in the adjustments, which is another point that Vanessa made that I think is decisive. The particularity of the moment, which is improbable. You know, the rhythms are there and everything should repeat, but the rhythm has been broken, the sound or the light. And these, I guess what I felt as I studied the building is it's settled. And yet, the more you're there and look at it, the more you realize there are things that are improbable and unexpected. And I think these disturbances in the norm, that's when maybe what has been hidden, the gods are always hidden. They keep themselves distant. But if you break with the pattern for a moment, that's what I think the building activates one's sensitivities to things that are in the normal run of affairs overlooked. And that's what I meant about the atypicality of some of your detailing, which I think is really the strength of the building in this sense of disclosure.
Thank you.
Brigitte, I have a question for you. Obviously, in the research you did for the building, did you spend any time looking at sort of Jewish artifacts, menorahs, pointers, candelabras, books, the symbolism of books themselves, and so forth, or Hebrew text, calligraphy?
I think that this community actually didn't have, other than their, 3 Torahs, they actually didn't have a lot of objects that were part of their kind of, there was no archive or kind of, sort of, there were very few material objects that they actually owned. It's a very young congregation, and that we really, I wouldn't say that we kind of focused on that. I think they gave us the program for the bima and the reading table and all of the pieces that they wanted to incorporate.
Because I'm possibly reading into it, but for me, the section also contains some of the DNA of Hebrew calligraphy, which is always done by hand. All the Torah scrolls are handwritten, and it's basically, inclined nib work, a little like Gothic lettering. Right. So it involves lots and lots of swoops, lots of tapers. Things taper as you move the pen around. And it's an art a little bit like Japanese calligraphy. It's the look of swiftness, the look of energy. To think of letters as sections. Sections as letters in a way. I don't know whether those thoughts, and the way you did the arc, or the with that very sharp Y shape.
So that's actually a counterbalance.
Yeah.
So it's so that when you open the door, it's like it acts as a counterbalance for the
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, when I saw that, it also was sort of like it was very resonant, and I think that you really could not have done a blocky thing there. It had to have that powerful diagonal again in it, to make it hold space on what's basically a series of ribs, and you've got to be able to say no, here, this is different right here.
While we're in
So,
the questions, I had just one
Yeah.
about the design. Did you ever think about making the floor still darker? I ask because I think stopping the light, grounding the light is probably equally important to intensifying it. And I couldn't actually tell. I do have to visit it, but I wondered how dark or absorptive the floor is.
It seemed to be shiny, wasn't it? It's reflective.
It's actually a retroplate concrete floor. So we
Oh.
actually visited a car showroom in Maine that had the same floor. I think that's a really interesting question or kind of comment, because I think it would have been stronger if it was a dark floor, because it would have, but I think that the kind of nature of the community, I think that would have never happened. And this kind of question of light and dark in architecture, I just think is a totally interesting and fascinating one. And just as a kind of anecdote, we actually went to visit Carlo Scarpa's Ottolenghi house, the one in the Lago di Garda. And when I went there, I'd never been there before, and I saw this totally black plaster ceiling. It was just so incredible because it has a roof on top of it. So it was almost like the pressure of the roof was being projected onto the ceiling of the interior space. And I just commented on how amazing this was. And it was the son of the owner. But I think what happened was Scarpa had proposed this ceiling. They actually never did it. And they felt so guilty because they actually didn't do it the way the architect had actually asked for. And then after Scarpa died, they actually redid the roof the way he had wanted it. So I was commenting on the roof, but it was not the original roof. It was the redone roof. But it was this kind of play of dark and light. And the
your columns have sort of shadow socks.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
And that, I think you have, I don't know, 8-10 centimeters of shadow space below the bima. And I think this substrate of the space is an important, because that's the surface of the water, the whole instability or darkness, and then the clarity that you've structured up above. It strikes me as a very key part of the project. And I guess like you, my urging would be the darker, the greater the continuity of the substrate makes everything above it, bima, the covenant, and then finally the lines of light. That whole thing would be structured vertically in a very effective way.
Bridget, you can always go back and polish it dark. Just
Yeah, right. Brigitte, I want to thank you for giving us hope in the world that a client actually felt guilty about something and fixed it after the architect was long gone.
It was the son of the client.
Yeah, but it's still the family, and it was. I think that's probably one of the most beautiful stories I've ever heard about architecture. But we have some questions from the audience, if you'd like to. A couple people actually asked what the relationship is between the parts on the site. These the education building and the synagogue itself.
So before there was a 2-story red brick Portland public school that the congregation rented for many years, and they renovated one area to be their sanctuary, and they used every part of the building. Then they purchased the building as part of the site, and it had a parking lot and a kind of open field, and it was adjacent to a Portland park. And at the very far end was a kind of this very famous Dunkin' Donuts drive-through at one end. So part of it is they bought a part of the school property, its parking lot, and a portion of the park to become the land for the site itself. And then what we did is we moved the entrance from this busy street to a side street, and that created the courtyard that you enter into that has the public school and the social hall and our kind of long piece, and so that creates the kind of new building, and the public park is adjacent to it. So people come and park in the parking lot and go to the public park if they're from further afield. The Dunkin' Donuts is still there. And then part of this fenced off area was to create a more controlled landscape. So we're working with these tilted planes. So you read the trees of the park beyond, but they're not part of the property of the synagogue. And we're sort of playing with all of that. And to kind of, so when you're standing on the outside of the fence, the earth is graded up. There's kind of all kinds of retaining walls so that it almost becomes a seamless condition between the park and the contained landscape. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, okay. Now, we actually have a question here from Carla Britton.
Yeah.
Carla. And she wanted to know, do you see your sacred architecture as contributing to new concepts of spirituality? And that's a big question, of course. Do you see it that way? I mean, you've shown us several spiritual buildings in your
So I would never see ourselves as being kind of, there are people that will say, we do religious buildings. I would say every project that we have that you would consider a sacred space has been a total accident that we ended up doing them. If there's no plan to say this is what we do. And so I can tell you each story for every building is totally different as to how we stumbled into doing them. And it just so happens that we end up having worked with Catholic nuns and with Taoists and, First Nations. It just has been totally not a kind of orchestrated agenda whatsoever. But I feel like this kind of opportunity to question the role of these buildings and to think about what is community at this part of the 21st century, to think about how people gather, why they gather, are so fascinating and so important as questions. So, so we've ended up having to really think about these things and to sort of find, sort of inventive ways to kind of enable them to do what they do in spaces that hopefully work for them.
Do you work in a way, is your process when you design a religious building any different from your process in designing anything else? I mean, I didn't think so. Okay.
We ask a lot of questions.
We ask a lot of questions. Right.
I would say maybe for a nonprofit group, like the questions have to be a bit more formalized.
Yeah.
Like, so you would ask those questions at a group meeting and there might be 60 people from the community and we have a great discussion and there's a way to document that to kind of, and then to bring it back to the same group to say, is this what we really heard? And does this seem like what, you talked about? And so there's kind of a bit of a more formal process there.
Yeah.
But I think that, and again, you're always designing the right process for the right group. So like with the Taoist temple, we kind of developed a whole scheme. And then this feng shui guy came along with his feng shui measuring tape. And it was really crazy because he should have been there from the beginning, but he wasn't, but maybe that was a good thing. And so there's a whole set of micro conditions that were really important for them because nothing could be orthogonal. And, so each kind of group has their own sort of process and you're just working with their.
Yeah. We have another process related question is, do you start working with clients early with models, or is the models, do the models really serve you more in the studio?
So I would say we share everything with our clients. We don't have a separate conversation. I think models for us are super important because they can project more than just a shape, or they're projecting a kind of beginning of a discussion about materiality, about spatial conditions. I would say we actually don't do we don't do computer renderings because I
Mhm.
feel like the renderings create a different condition where they're not part of our process. And so I would say models and drawings are maybe a bit more open-ended than computer renderings are, because
Yeah.
they're so finite. So people end up like, it's like they're shopping. I like this, I don't like this. I like this, but I want it this way. It's a different conversation than a model where it's about, you know, how light enters a space, or it has a different, it's just a different kind of reading. And so for us, we just, you know, all of our process, we just have a conversation with our clients as if we're just talking in the studio, and there's not a different process. And we don't, any models we do, we typically are all in-house. Like we don't have
Yeah.
we don't do anything out of, it's like, it's a really part of a thinking process that's kind of fundamental.
Okay. All right. You know, this series of conversations that we've been having here over the course of the past 4 or 5 months have been, you know, the whole series is called spirituality in contemporary architecture. And I really like the fact that you started this presentation talking about non-religious buildings that you have been. So I wanted to ask you if you could comment or tell us how spirituality is present in those non-religious structures,
Hmm.
because I think it is. But I would like
Sure.
to get
Yeah.
your ideas on that.
Well, I mean, I think that this kind of question of how you register where you are, you know, the latitude, the context, the kind of place. So I think of ourselves as not so much designing buildings as actually making places.
Yeah.
And places encompasses the built form, the landscape, the interaction between all of those things. And that hopefully when you visit one of these places, you come away kind of understanding more about the place, the geology, the kind of trees, the kind of the DNA of what makes that place its own thing. Which is maybe the opposite of a kind of more international view where I design something and it can fit here or plop it down here. It's a kind of, our starting point is really different in that when we're all done, you can't imagine this place without that building and that landscape. There's a kind of fusion of all of those conditions that make them like one thing, and that you feel like you've been in a place and know more about it once you've left than when you arrived. And so it's the composite of so many factors, and you know, that you're kind of left knowing a place better than when you arrived. But it isn't just, but the building can't do all of that, and the landscape can't do all of that, and the siting can't do all. It's all of them layered onto each other. That is kind of more of a whole condition.
So the goal is enlightenment from start to finish. Okay. Well, listen, we are about out of time here. Vanessa, did you have a quick question?
Oh, I wanted to comment on that because it's a great question, and I loved your answer as well, that the spirituality sounded to me in what you said to be a perfect integrity of a location with the context, with the people at a particular period of time. And if that turns out, then it's a perfect expression of integrity, or this kind of full self-expression of that location and those people. I just wanted to add that because I just thought it was a really interesting way of thinking about what is spirituality in a place.
Yeah.
I think it's also plain that outside of our Western tradition, there is a sense of, well, it used to be called cosmology, where the world holds together, and some opening into the correspondences of things might be a way of thinking about the spiritual that doesn't automatically align it with one or another religious practice.
Mhm.
But there is a sense that this project has put together things that are normally in our categorical approach to life held apart.
Yeah.
That's what the stories that we tend to call cosmologies.
I think the work of architects is inherently spiritual. I think that's what makes it architecture.
Mhm.
Honestly, I know we're all struggling to not just repeat the forms of traditional religions, nor the forms of traditional buildings, and so, you know, the struggle is on to find out what it means to be spiritual but not religious, which like 80% of the people in this world say they are. So, but, and I'm like, I'm on board with it, and I'm trying myself to do the same, as we all are. But I do occasionally feel a sense of loss that we have to lighten our balloon. We have indeed thrown a lot of stuff overboard, and I think it's easier now to make the claim than it has been in the past.
Yeah. I want to thank our panelists and certainly Brigitte for sharing her work this afternoon, and our panelists for commenting on it. And also want to thank the audience for being here and asking some really, really great questions. And if you can, please join us on April 9th. Our next speaker will be Nader Ardalan, who will be talking about a project of his in Iran. And thanks again for being with us today.
Thank you,
Very
Michael.
much.
Take care.
Thank you
Thank you,
very much.
panelists.
Much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.
Yep, thank you.